Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome. Thank you very much for being with us today. We at Beaufort and our colleagues at Development Finance today are delighted that you are here with us to talk about an important unlocking investment opportunities in the regions. Things are changing quite radically in that respect. If you look at what's happened recently, growth in London has noticeably slowed down, while the opposite has actually happened outside the M25. There are many regions which are seeing sustained growth and offer exciting development opportunities. This morning we will consider how best to take advantage of those opportunities and the locations that really should look at to become involved. My colleague Mark Quigley will shortly introduce our impressive panel. They have considerable investment and development experience throughout the United Kingdom. Before doing so, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Steve Norris, probably well known to many of you, but just to remind you, he is a former Minister of Transport. He is chair of the National Infrastructure Planning Association. He is also senior advisor to BNP Paribas Real Estate, and also chairman of Soho Estates. I'm delighted actually he's got the time to be here this morning. Steve, thank you very much for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Steve Norris.
I'm not sure I need to stand on that thing, so forgive me if I don't. Thank you very much, Paul. It's a very kind introduction. Much kinder than you normally get when you've been in politics for a long time. And thanks very much for the invitation, because I was really attracted to this whole concept of the seminar, because I think it is the big issue for the whole of the development industry, and wider than just development, wider than just property. It has huge ramifications. And my starting point is precisely that when we talk about investing in the regions, it really is, sort of terra incognita. It's where dragons are on a big map. Why on earth would I want to go to the regions, for God's sake? What do they have? When you look at the UK, as distinct from most of the other major economies in Europe, there is actually one very, very striking difference, and it's not an attractive one. If you take France and Germany, for example, all of their major cities actually have above national average per capita GDP. Or to put it in simple terms, all their major cities are actually centres of activity, generate economic activity, and are themselves therefore fairly wealthy places. So, in France that would be not just Paris, it would be Paris and Nantes and Lyon and Marseille and Toulouse and so on. And in Germany, not just, shall we say, Frankfurt, but Frankfurt and Berlin and obviously Munich and Hamburg and so on. All of these places have above national average per capita GDP. They're centres of wealth. In the UK, I think, very sad reality is that there is only one city in the country. Actually, we'll confine ourselves, as I think the map will suggest, to England, if I may, because most of what I'm saying is about England. It's actually true as it happens to the whole of the UK. There is only one city that has above national average per capita GDP, and you're in it. All the others, massively improved as they may have been over the last 20 years, you go to Bullring in Birmingham, you go to Manchester and see what's happening there around Deansgate and so on. You go to Leeds, where they're very proud of having Harvey Nichols, or Liverpool won, where the Duke of Westminster kind of very generously injected £1 billion of his money, which is very kind of him, because no other sane investor ever would. And I say that as a born and bred Liverpudlian, but we'll leave that out. This is actually a hugely worrying and challenging proposition, that London is so much wealthier than the rest of the country as of today. Wealthier in terms of per capita income, per capita GDP, house prices, rental levels, and so on. And that's not healthy. It's not healthy economically, it's not healthy politically. The big issue, which Labour is discussing in Liverpool, today, and which the Tories will be talking about next week in Birmingham, is inequality. If we'll forget the noise around Brexit and so on, most of which is just that, it's just noise, believe me. The real issue that, if you remember Mrs. May mentioned the day she got elected as leader, it's inequality. It's inequality between the perception that those with assets, those who benefited from quantitative easing and so on, are doing very, very well indeed, and the wealthy are getting wealthier, whilst those who don't necessarily own assets of any significant value have not seen real wages rise for a very long time. Now, when you're tackling that inequality, and everybody wants to tackle that inequality because it's incredibly unhealthy, it's where real issues for countries actually germinate. That's if you like, the origin of insurrection, to put it in simple terms. When you want to try and do something about inequality, I suppose the classic mistake is to assume that you make the poor richer by making the rich poorer. Sadly, it never works. It's been tried, often is. It's the first call of anyone on the far left of politics. Just take all that money from rich people and give it back to poor people, and everything will be fine. Well, I don't suppose, sitting here as you all are, you all look incredibly rich to me in our house, that I actually have to sort of just point out that sadly, trying to make the poor richer by making the rich poorer simply doesn't work. So what does work? Well, we know actually two propositions essentially. One is education, because education remains a massive divide. I happen to be, I hadn't intended to say this, but as it happens, it's the case. I was born in what you would call a slum area in Liverpool, but I got an 11 plus, went to grammar school, got a scholarship to Oxford. That wasn't unusual, incidentally. About 8 or 9 people in my year in my school went to Oxbridge with places or scholarships. It wasn't considered unusual. Doesn't happen now. Doesn't happen now in Liverpool, where entrance to Oxbridge are very, very rare indeed. And once you've got an Oxford degree, God knows, you ought to be able to look after yourself in business and elsewhere, which I and many, many, many people like me did. Education remains the key. It's something we've failed on over the last half century. It's something we've got to do a lot more about. But the other obvious issue is connectivity. It's simply that the regions are out there. They're not places that we necessarily either feel the need to visit or particularly want to visit. They're a long way away. Why should I bother? And actually the key to addressing that issue of inequality is not through taxation. It's through investment. It's through investment in infrastructure. It's through investment not just in, if you like, the very visible infrastructure, but in things like 5G, and rollout of good, fast broadband. It's helped by the fact that working practices are now changing radically. Firms have realised that the second biggest cost they have after the cost of employing people is housing those people. Intelligent firms are actively encouraging people to work flexibly, to work, as McKinsey call it, working on the pause. McKinsey were the first to take a place in Terminal 5 at Heathrow for McKinsey staff, because McKinsey staff are passing through Terminal 5 every day of the week, and they just want somewhere where they can work. As they could work while they're taking a coffee in Starbucks. And how many small businesses are draining Starbucks electricity on 1 cup of coffee all morning to start a business? Because they can. Because that kind of internet connectivity is having a really significant impact on the way we conduct our affairs nationally. And of course, the great thing about it is that distance is immaterial. Distance is immaterial. Speed of access is important, but distance doesn't matter anymore. And the second big change in infrastructure is simply connecting the people without jobs to the jobs without people. That's why, for example, I'm a huge fan of HS2. HS2 is much in the news, and people say, oh God, the cost is rising. Yeah, the cost is rising over what the original estimate was, and why didn't they rise further? But the point about it is that it's as vital a piece of infrastructure in terms of equalising this country, enriching this country, as the Bazalgette sewerage system was to London in the 19th century. Incidentally, that's the system. Until the new tideway tunnel opens, that we're still actually relying on to this day, you know. I was on the Treasury's Growth Task Force, which Paul Dighton, when he was the Treasury Minister, led. One of the things we did was to go around the country and talk to each of the recipient cities, if you like, these regional cities, to ask them, first of all, are you prepared for HS2 when it comes? What are you going to do about it when it arrives? Is it literally just going to be a station stop? Are you going to do something about the area that the station will, you know, enrich? Are you tackling all of those connectivity issues that flow from having these new people arriving in your city? And what was interesting was, first of all of those cities, all Labour-led cities, Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, Sheffield, all saying, yes, please. The only thing we really care about is it's taking too long to deliver. Do it as soon as you can, and we're ready. Interestingly, when we asked them, Paul Dighton being a very generous sort of chap, do you have a money issue? Is it about extra money? They all said no, we don't need more money. Actually, if we could spend the money the government gave us, as we know would make best value, that would be a real help. But actually it's not about money at all. We're ready, we want it, because it's vital to our city. And I actually heard one or two people saying that the effect of HS2, these are people incidentally generally who live in the children's, God bless them, and just don't want it. And fine, I kind of understand that. You know, we don't have NIMBYism, as you know, anymore in this country. We have banana. Banana build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. You know, but those people would say the effect of HS2 will solely be to drag activity out of the regions into London. Well, that does seem to me to be an utterly absurd proposition. Actually, already you know that the leading law firms and the leading, the big four accounting firms and others keep their nice old Etonians in Hanover Square or you know, St James's Square or the city or wherever, to be really nice to the incoming customers and to meet and greet, and all the real work is done in Leeds and Manchester and Liverpool and Birmingham already. It's already happening. Why? Well, rental levels, cost of employment, that's wage cost, rent levels, all other costs. It isn't just, you know, wages that are lower in the regions. All the cost of living in the regions is lower than it is in the UK. And increasingly, as 1,000 HSBC staff go to Birmingham, as 350 Ford Credit staff go to Manchester, and we see other companies taking advantage of the infrastructure that's already there. We see this inevitable drift away from the cost of London into the regions. And that's, I think, you know, why, alongside HS2, we do need that northern powerhouse concept, which George Osborne created, and credit to him. He was a Northwestern MP when he was in the House of Commons, and he could see that actually there is another 10 million people. We got nearly that in London, but nearly 13, incidentally, 13 million during the working day, but there are another 10 million people in the UK, up there in the north, in a great swathe from Liverpool to Hull. And that if you could somehow make activity between them more accessible and easier to do, then that too might encourage that sense of growth and that sense of real opportunity. So, for example, the new line that will connect Manchester to Leeds, that's an absolutely vital economic link, will replace, or actually augment, I should say, something which is currently called the Transpennine Express. The Transpennine Express takes an hour to do 40 miles from Leeds to Manchester. If that's your idea of an express, then you're probably living in the last century. You know, it isn't at all. So that kind of connectivity as well you need. And the good news for us talking about this issue today is that government broadly gets this. You know, the National Infrastructure Commission, which I was very much involved in terms of its birth and its subsequent activity, has told government just the size of the package and gives a sense of priority for how those schemes should be delivered. And the schemes I'm talking about, HS2, of course, you know, is going to happen. It is there, and already, you know, we've spent several billion on it. We're going to be spending several billion more. We're going to start the actual physical construction, you know, very, very shortly. I just hope to be alive at my age, you know, it's kind of, so I have to work out the date. Christ, I'll be about 95, but never mind. You know, I'm at the age where I used to say about David Cameron, he was the first Prime Minister whose father I knew rather better. That's, leave that aside. These things will take time, of course they will, but they're coming. And they're coming because that drive to the regions is now becoming a reality. People aren't waiting. And there's a big difference, incidentally, between the regions and London, which I also think is somewhat overlooked. But to me, having had some experience in these towns and cities, is very real. In London, the general response of planners is go away. You know, there are many boroughs, I'm afraid, and some of them Tory, some of them Labour, you probably know them, where the whole attitude to development is, do you really have to do this? You know, the 106s, the sills, and God knows what, are incredibly onerous. They take years to negotiate. The actual planning consent itself will be disputed. Heights will be reduced, massing will be reduced. Really, the whole accent is, we really would prefer you just not to do this. I've been looking at some of the stuff that Westminster's been saying recently since the last election. I think they got a bit scared because they thought that, you know, for a moment they might lose control. The Tories might lose control in Westminster in the event it didn't happen. That's why they suddenly decided they were against pedestrianising Oxford Street from Marble Arch to Oxford Circus. It would have made a huge, sensible move. I'm not sure about the next phase down to Holborn, but certainly that first phase made enormous sense, not difficult. They were more terrified about a few elderly voters who live in Wigmore Street, around which there might have been a bus. Ooh, a bus. God, my dear, standards are really falling. And so they scrapped the whole scheme, you know. And I read a speech that Nicky Aiken, the leader of Westminster, made not so long ago, which honestly Jeremy Corbyn could have made. You know, we're now a planning authority for the many, not the few. It's time to engage our local people in all of the big... No, it isn't. Because, you know, banana, remember banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. That's the general rule in the south of England. You know, it isn't helpful. It isn't the way progress is made. And it's a massive contrast with what you find when you go and talk to city planners in places like Birmingham and Manchester and Liverpool and Leeds. And, you know, I was in Doncaster the other day. Doncaster, incidentally, is getting these new Azuma trains, Hitachi's new high-speed trains. They'll replace the whole train stock and some of that other first group stock on the East Coast Main Line. It'll put Doncaster an hour and a quarter to King's Cross. I mean, I'll tell you what, I live in Wandsworth, it takes me an hour and a quarter to get to King's Cross, and that's, you know, that's on the tube. Seriously, the point is that this kind of connectivity is happening. But the great thing about going to a place like that, going to Liverpool, going to Leeds, is that when you talk to the city, you know, government there, the politicians as well as the officers, the answer is, how can we help you? How can we actually help you to invest in our city? Because we really want you. You know, you want cash, you want, you know, us to prepare maybe the ground, put in some of the original groundworks to make your site viable. How big do you want to go? You know, what do you want to do? What can we do to help you? Of course there are rules. Nobody expects there not to be rules. But that whole attitude that says, please come, we'd love to have you, I think is one of the major reasons that makes the regions these days much more attractive. Now, in technical terms, I think we understand that the housing market in London is undergoing a correction. At the top end, I think that correction may well prove to be more permanent. I mean at the real top end, on a day when Mr. Abramovich was apparently denied Swiss citizenship. You know, I pass no further comment, but to say that what's happening in Mayfair or Bishop's Avenue doesn't detain me all that much in terms of the wealth of our city. However, it's pretty clear that there is a correction. It happens. There is no single graph on earth that just goes straight up in a 45 degrees north line. I don't think we should trouble ourselves too much. But what is evident is that, you know, London is full. I've written a lot about peak London. Doesn't mean peak forever, but peak certainly in terms of us being the coolest city on the planet and so on. Because issues like the cost of housing, like connectivity, are actually proving to be genuine constraints on the speed at which a city can grow. Our excitement, of course, will be when Crossrail actually does open, when the Elizabeth line actually finally is open in that central section. It's real sad that it's going to take longer than we thought. That was not something that was planned for obvious reasons. It's not something that was held back to announce as late as it was. It's literally to do with the process of actually safety casing the signalling, where you're interfacing between Network Rail's lines and signalling at both ends of the line, going out to Reading and going up to Shenfield particularly, with the new equipment and the new trains and so on. It's proved to be more challenging than I thought, but it'll look. And when it does, it actually just underlines this point about connectivity, doesn't it? Because it means that people who live in Reading and Maidenhead, for example, will be able to get not just to the West End, but to the city and to Docklands in a matter of a few minutes on a single train. And in London, they'll be paying TfL prices, they'll be paying ordinary tube prices for their journey. You know, that's a massive benefit to London, but it just exemplifies how, you know, those similar benefits come out of things like HS2 and HS3, and what they can actually deliver to the country as a whole. So I think, you know, housing in London, not necessarily as attractive as it's been over the past years. Commercial yields in London, now at levels where it's hard to see a significant amount of upside. You know, we know that over the next few years, central bankers around the world will try to lift interest rates to a minimum of 3%, because that's the only point at which interest rates start to be a tool that a financial manager of a country's economy can actually use. You can't get anything out of rates of less than 1% in terms of real significant movement. So that's an inevitable trend. And when that happens, you're going to see yields, particularly in central London commercial, as I say, looking less attractive than perhaps they might have been a few years ago. Outside London, yields better, housing markets much more open to developments, cost of construction lower, cost of living lower, and potential uplift extremely attractive. So enough from me, but because you've got a much brighter panel who will now say much more sensible things, I'm sure. But as far as I'm concerned, this business of investing in the regions is not just a nice to have. If you're in development, whether in resi or commercial or mixed use or whatever, if you buy to let or build to sell, these are the markets that are now the future for our industry. And we really should go for them 100%. There you go.